carries on. Saul replied, said to David, you are not able to go out against this Philistine and fight him. You are only a young man. And he has been a warrior from his youth. So Saul is telling David, listen, you cannot face Goliath. You can't face this giant. You're a small man. You're a small boy. But Goliath has been a warrior, has been fighting from his youth. Verse 34, but David said to Saul, your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion or a bear came and carried off the sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by the hair, struck it, and killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them. Why? Because he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine. David reminded Saul that the key to his success did not lie in anywhere else but God. Here was a little boy facing a giant that was more experienced than him, bigger than him. And yet, even though the entire Israelite army was afraid of this giant, David refused to be afraid. David kept his focus on the Lord. And what happened? In David's eyes, Goliath became like the grasshopper. The Israelite army had focused on Goliath, so they became the grasshoppers. But David, a little boy, who had a relationship with God, and I'm going to talk about that, it's very, very important. David kept his focus on the Lord, on the faithfulness of God, on the power of God. And because of that, he was filled with faith enough to approach Goliath confidently, courageously, and boldly. Look at what he says again. Verse 37. David said, the Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will what? Will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine. So what we see in 1 Samuel 17 is a young boy, a young David, reminding himself of the faithfulness of God in the past. Because he knew that the lion that he killed and the bear that he killed wasn't because of him. It was because of the goodness of God to him, the presence of God with him, the faithfulness of God to him. So he understood if God was faithful then, God is going to be faithful now. And this filled David with faith. David was full of faith. He was so full of faith, he was not even afraid of Goliath. He said something very interesting to Goliath. What did he say to Goliath just before the battle began? 1 Samuel 17:45. What did he say to Goliath? Let's go back a bit. So when David confronts Goliath, verse 42 says, so he, that is Goliath, looked David over. So Goliath looked David over and saw that he was a little more than a boy. So the Goliath is looking at David, he's looking down at David and saw that he was a little more than a boy, glowing with health and handsome, and he despised him. Goliath despised David. He said to David, am I a dog that you come at me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. Verse 44, come here, he said, I will give your flesh to the birds and the wild animals. So Goliath was 100% sure that he was going to utterly destroy David. Verse 45, interesting. David said to the Philistine, listen to this. David said to the Philistine, you come against me with a sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day, the the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. This very day I will give your carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds and the wild animals, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. All those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or by spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is what? Is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands. David was so full of courage and boldness and faith in God that he tells Goliath, a giant, that this day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. While the whole Israelite army was cowering on the side, terrified, this little boy understood who was behind him. He understood that he had the presence of God with him. He understood that he could rely on the faithfulness of God. And because of that, Goliath became like a grasshopper in David's eyes. Why? Because David, was comparing Goliath to the Lord. And this is why David could be bold and confident. David focused on the Lord. And because of that, Goliath became like a grasshopper in his eyes. Let's read the account of David's victory. Verse 48.